The thing that I was really gripped by, if I consider Colossians 1, 9 through 29, we spent 21 weeks in this passage, and I feel like when we studied it, I really had a chance to dive in deeply. And I was really drawn to the fact that in verse 9 it says, "For this reason also." And given that I'd already spent so much time considering the 21 verses here, I was considering more of what had been written earlier. Paul, obviously, he's making this really bold prayer. We haven't ceased to pray for you and to ask all these amazing things. And he's making a pretty bold request. And I was considering what's written earlier in the chapter to understand why Paul felt he could have such boldness. And so one thing really jumped out at me, and I'd like to share that with you, which actually comes before the passage that we memorized. But I'll start with a question. If someone asked you, have you truly heard of God's grace? Do you truly understand the grace of God? What would you say? How would you answer? If they ask, do you truly understand the grace of God? And if they ask you to prove it, so to speak, prove to me that you truly understand the grace of God, what would you say? What would you point to? Is there something that you would point to be able to prove it empirically, so to speak, that you've truly understood the grace of God? Paul's letter here, what he mentions about the Colossians, he says something which really grabbed a hold of my heart, and it helps me understand how I hope to answer that question as well. In verse 5 and verse 6 is what I want to look at. He says, "You've previously heard of the word of truth, the gospel which has come to you, just as in all the world also. It is constantly bearing fruit and increasing, even as it has been doing in you also since the day you heard it and understood the grace of God in truth." So Paul says here in verses 5 and 6 that something has been happening since the day they heard and understood the grace of God in truth. What accompanied their truly understanding the grace of God? It says in verse 6, the word is constantly bearing fruit and increasing. And that to me is the proof that I have truly understood the grace of God, is that the gospel is constantly bearing fruit. And not only is it constantly bearing fruit in my life, but the fruitfulness of my life is increasing season after season, that I'm increasing in fruitfulness. And the proof that I've heard and truly understood the grace of God is that these things accompany it. Jesus mentioned in the parable of the soils, if you want to turn there briefly, it's in Mark chapter 4. He's telling the parable of the sower and the soils, and he mentions all of these various soils. But in verse 8, it says, "Other seeds fell in the good soil, and as they grew up and increased, they yielded a crop and produced 30, 60, and 100-fold. And I think I've always thought about the 30, 60, and 100-fold as kind of three different seeds. Like one seed produced 30, another seed produced 60, and another seed produced 100-fold. But I see here he says that the seeds grew up and increased. He's talking about a seed. A seed in its first year produces 30, in its second year produces 60, in its third year produces 100-fold. He's saying that the fruitfulness of the seed, the proof of a good soil, is that its fruitfulness increases season after season. He says the same thing that Paul says in verse 5, that the gospel is being proclaimed in all the earth, and it's constantly bearing fruit and increasing, just as it has been doing in you, Colossians, ever since the day you heard of it and understood the grace of God in truth. And it brought home the question for me, is my life like the Colossians, constantly bearing fruit in and out of season? We've heard, about being like a tree planted by waters, which always bears fruit in season. And also, and even more of a big question for me is, not just am I bearing fruit, but am I increasingly bearing fruit? Am I bearing more fruit over time? Can I look back and see more and more of the fruit of the Spirit in my life? So what do I mean by bearing fruit? I think the fruit of the Spirit, obviously, is the first thing that comes to my mind. Can I say that I have more love for my brothers and sisters than I had last year? The fruit of the Spirit is love, and it's joy. Can I say I have more joy in any circumstance than I had last year? The fruit of the Spirit is peace. Can I say I have more peace in the midst of uncertainty is a given in our lives, right? Always a given. Do I have more peace in the midst of uncertainty in this year than I had last year, this month than I had last month? The fruit of the Spirit is patience and kindness. Am I more patient and kind with my children in the areas maybe where I'm tested in patience and kindness than I have been in years past, and on and on and on. This is a question which has really convicted me and encouraged me also, that my expectation ought to be that I'd be increasing in fruitfulness in every season with the Lord. And I ought to be looking and examining. What this did for me is it made me examine, am I the kind of person about whom Paul could pray this amazing prayer? I'm asking that you would be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so that you will walk in a manner worthy of the Lord. Of whom is he saying that? The people who, ever since the day they heard of it, are constantly bearing fruit and increasing, thus proving that they have heard and understood the grace of God in truth. So how do we increase in fruitfulness? I think increasing in fruitfulness is increasing in Christlikeness, right? In John chapter 3, I was thinking about what John the Baptist says. You know the phrase. Hopefully you're already thinking of it. He must increase, but what? I must decrease. I see that if I want Jesus Christ increasing in me, increasing fruitfulness, Christ-likeness, I have to have less and less of Jeremy. Jeremy has to be diminishing of my flesh, my personality, my will, my ambitions. I have to be decreasing. And it lines up with what Jesus said. If you look at John 12, Jesus, I think he mentions something of the secret to fruitfulness in John 12. It's in verse 24. He says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." So I see here Jesus saying that the way to fruitfulness is death. The way to Christ increasing in me is me dying more and more. And if I want the fruit of the Spirit and the fruit to be increasing in my life to be increasing in fruitfulness, then I have to be increasing in my own deathfulness, so to speak, in my own dying to myself. I have to increase in dying to myself. And if my fruit isn't increasing, if I can look back and if in an honest assessment of my life that my love isn't increasing or my joy isn't increasing, is stagnating or it's going backwards, my patience, I'm less patient than I used to be. If any of those things are true in my honest assessment, then it's evidence that I'm not falling into the ground and dying. Because Jesus promised, if a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it will bear much fruit. And if our promise and hope and expectation of God that we would be increasing in fruitfulness, if we're not seeing it, then it must be an indication we aren't dying. And then we can seek the Lord and say, Lord, where am I not dying? How do I need to die to myself? I had the experience even in my own home. I see a lack of fruitfulness in some area, and I say, Lord, where am I not dying? And He's faithful to show me. He says, this is a clear area where you need to be dying, where you need to be stepping up and dying, and you aren't. And I've seen it to be true that if I'll honestly ask the Lord to show me, He will do it. He'll show me where I need to die. And I was thinking, Michelle and I had a chance last night. We did some reflecting on 2016, and I would encourage you to do this if you haven't made a practice of it. At some point, towards the end of the year, beginning of next year, reflect on the year. And we just sat down and we said, okay, let's not take out our notebooks. We could start with our Bibles and our notebooks, and we could kind of jog our memories, but let's just start with what happened this year. What did the Lord teach us? And it was actually one of the biggest blessings I can remember, just of a way to spend an evening together, just to say, what has the Lord taught us? And I feel like it was like 2016 was almost like a dog year. They say dog years are like 7 normal years. It's like we had a dog year this last year, like 7 years worth of growth and learning and growing, I feel, in the Lord. And as I appreciate, I want to thank God and proclaim His goodness in that, for sure. But as I think about that in light of Colossians 1:6, I have a hope that I'll have I want a double dog year next year. I want 14 years worth of growth, so to speak, or I don't know what it is. It's not mathematical, but the point is, I want even more, as thankful and as appreciative as I am of all that God has done and taught and led and grown in our hearts. I have this passage, this letter that Paul wrote has really stirred my heart to long for more and to not even be settled with the same yield next year. I want more. I want to increase in fruitfulness. I believe it's a promise of God. I believe it's an expectation. And as I grow in my understanding of the grace of God, I want my fruitfulness to grow as well.